The Nabateans thrived in the Shira Mountains for several centuries. Growing wealthy from the spice trade they controlled here at Petra. Their kings and queens used their immense riches to have the best of everything, in life and in death.
The Nabatean kings ruled Petra for nearly 3 centuries. They were able to maintain their seat of wealth and power up through the 1st century AD by bribing and allying with the rival Assyrians, Egyptians, and later, the Romans. Ultimately, their alliance with the Roman Empire would cost them control over the city. To find out why, I'm meeting Chris Tuttle, Assistant Director for the American Center of Oriental Research. Chris explains that the emperors of Rome had long coveted the Red Rose City. The Romans conquered the Nabatean kingdom during the 1st century, and the Emperor Trajan made Petra Rome's Arabian capital in 106 AD. One structure that best illustrates the Roman dominance at Petra is the Great Temple, once the largest freestanding building on site. Chris takes me to a section of the temple to see a collection of Roman and Nabatean artifacts.
The capitals we were just looking at. The space we're in is called a cryptoporticus. It's a large gallery beneath the colonnade. Most of this material comes from the main temple building itself.
Chris shows me a collection of decorative Roman cornices that once adorned the temple columns.
You know what that is?
It's a pine cone?
Pine cone.
He tells me these sculpted symbols reflected vegetation from both Rome and Petra.
So we have acanthus, we have vines, we have pine cones. Pomegranates and poppy seeds.
Right.
Stacked next to Chris, I notice a curious pile of stone balls.
These are a type of weapon.
Yes.
They're called ballista balls.
Would you throw them?
Well, they would have been lobbed using a catapult-like piece of war machinery called a ballistae.
Ah, okay.
And we think they were stockpiled in anticipation of a possible conflict.
Chris explains that the ballista balls were actually found buried beneath the floors of the temple. They were created by the Nabateans during the 1st century AD, the time of transition with the Romans. While these projectiles were clearly made for defense, they were never used. Chris says that the physical evidence of warfare at Petra is both scant and ambiguous. Most archaeologists believe the Nabatean rulers negotiated a peaceful settlement with the Roman Empire. This would protect their citizens and preserve their trade routes.
What happens to the Nabateans?
Well, what we're really talking about is a change in government. The people who lived their lives here, ran their shops and carried out their trade, did their farming, they stayed the same as far as we can tell.
Chris believes the Nabateans were allowed to continue their trade, but under Roman control. Archaeologists like Chris must rely on the physical record to mark the transition of power.
So most of the changes that we can track is architectural.
Architecturally.
Can we see more?
Yes. Why don't we go take a look at some of it?
Okay.
Chris directs me to the rear section of the Great Temple to see another part of the Roman complex. This was an amphitheater that once sat up to 600 people.
Do we know what this space was used for?
Well, not specifically. There's a number of theories. This could have been ritual theater. It could have been special performances for just the elite. Or this could have been where the Council of Elders met. All through this period, Petra remained a seat of power. And the fact that it continued to be a seat of power is evident in the continued expenditure of monies to make these massive modifications to these giant buildings.
But even as the Romans are modifying this space, we still believe it was an important space.
Absolutely.
And perhaps the seat of power for both the Nabateans and the Romans.
Quite possibly. This is the largest freestanding building in Petra. And so it served a major purpose.
In 330 AD, the Emperor Constantine moved the Roman capital to the eastern city of Byzantium, also known as Constantinople. The Christian Byzantines would go on to rule Petra for the next 3 centuries. To better connect Rome to China's Silk Road and India, the ancient trade routes to Petra were redirected north to Palmyra and Bostra, Roman strongholds since the 1st century AD. Chris believes this move marginalized Petra and marked the beginning of the end for the Nabateans. Petra's occupation had been pieced together largely through a sampling of Roman texts and limited archaeology. But in 1993, a major discovery was uncovered at this beautifully restored Byzantine church.
We have very few written records from the Nabatean period and the Roman period. But from the Byzantine period, we're much more fortunate. We have a single cache of papyri that was found in this church.
Chris explains archaeologists recovered 150 papyrus scrolls preserved under a pile of rubble. Scholars speculate an earthquake destroyed the church in the early 7th century AD.
Can I see them?
Yes, it'll take a trip to Amman, though.
I'll go to Amman.
All right.
Chris and I leave Petra and travel 120 miles north back to the Jordanian capital of Amman. He's brought me to the headquarters of the American Center of Oriental Research, ACOR. The papyri are kept here in deep storage. Chris explains that these artifacts from the Byzantine period provide a unique glimpse into the lives of the ancient Nabateans.
What you're looking at is exactly the way the papyri were found.
Looks like charcoal.
It does look like charcoal. The charcoal is the only reason we in fact have the papyrus. These were preserved because they caught fire during the earthquake that destroyed the church. And immediately while they were burning, the shelves that they were on and the wall behind the shelves collapsed, sealing the burning papyrus under a pile of rubble so there was no oxygen. So they sat there and smoldered, and as a result they carbonized, and this is why we have them today.
It's ironic that the fire which should have destroyed them actually preserved them.
Absolutely.
Chris lets me examine some of the carbonized fragments, preserved in ash for nearly 1,400 years. He explains these scrolls are so delicate that they must be kept in sealed containers and stored in darkness to keep them from falling apart. Some fragments represent the ends of documents and remain rolled tight, while other fragments, with text, have been flattened and affixed to rice paper. Since the ancient papyrus is carbonized, it's hard to decipher the writing.
I can definitely make out scratch marks. I can't read that. What language is that?
It's in Greek.
In Greek.
Byzantine Greek.
Based on the scrolls, Chris explains Greek was the primary written language used in Petra during the Byzantine period. At the other end of the table, several of the papyrus fragments have been flattened and placed under sheets of glass.
So once the fragments have been assembled and then enhanced so that they're readable, what do they say?
These scrolls all belong to a single archive of a single family.
All of this is from one family?
All one family, 7 generations represented. The main owner of the documents was a man by the name of Theodorus, and he was a deacon and later an archdeacon in the Petra church.
So this is a wealthy family?
It was a very well-off family of the time. All of the documents deal with legal issues for the most part. Issues of property division, taxation, deeds, wills, that sort of thing.
The charred archive also includes dowry arrangements and family disputes dating back to the early 6th century AD. What's clear from the text is that some of Petra's citizens living during the Byzantine period were still very established and very wealthy. Chris tells me this family held enough property and assets to be placed in America's upper class today. Sadly, the earthquake which led to the preservation of the papyri marked the beginning of the end for Petra. Most scholars believe the Nabateans couldn't survive both the loss of their trade routes and a catastrophic natural disaster. Petra was largely abandoned by the end of the 7th century. Scholars believe the ancient Nabateans simply took their fortunes and left.
So from an archaeological point of view, this is the treasure?
For us,
right?
Yes, this is the treasure.
Because this is giving us insights into a world that we wouldn't have known about without it.
Absolutely.
Could there be other treasures like this still at Petra?
Given that less than 2% of the city's been excavated, statistically speaking, the likelihood is there.
Built by the Nabateans over 2,000 years ago, Petra still stands as a great symbol of lost opulence and power. Today, great stone facades and elaborate tombs commemorate the kings and queens who once ruled this region. These Arabian traders harnessed their natural resources and created an oasis for camel caravans looking to make their fortunes in the desert. With the help of modern science, we may one day rediscover hidden riches here at Petra. But for now, this beautiful stone city continues to guard its secret treasure.